Good morning, audience. My name is Kyle Swan. I'm director of the Center for Practical and Professional Ethics here at Sac State. Today, with some very nice support from the Visiting Scholars Program, the center is bringing you Dr. Justin Sitzma of Victoria University, Wellington in New Zealand. Dr. Sitzma is a senior lecturer there in the School of History, Philosophy, and Political Science and International Relations. His research focuses on questions in philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology, and today he's doing a little bit of experimental philosophy, which uses some empirical methods to approach traditional topics of philosophy. So we actually have him for two talks, one right now, and one later this afternoon at 1:30. Hope you can come back and join us for that. But now, I'll just turn things over to Dr. Sitzma. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation. It's really great to be here. I used to live when I was young in Sacramento and used to, as a kid, ride my bike through the Sac State campus and such, so it's really sort of fun to come back, a little bit of things looking very familiar and then very different at the same time. Let me jump into it. Usually this talk takes me or like 50 minutes or so I'm going to just try to keep it going. Here's the setup for what I'll be talking about today. In philosophy, amongst philosophers, it's often taken to just be obvious that when it comes to questions of God, questions in philosophy of religion, where we're exploring the existence of God or nature of God, that philosophers' prior beliefs correspond with their assessment of religious arguments. Now, I don't think that this is likely to be specific just to philosophers. I expect that this is something that might seem obvious to many of you, that if you want to know, discussing an argument for the existence of God or just the question of the existence of God, an awfully good way to predict what someone's going to say about this question or these arguments is going to be to know something about their prior religious beliefs. That is, religious people are probably going to give it the thumbs up, non-religious the thumbs down. Well, there's a sense that this is what's going on in philosophy, just taken to be pretty clear. Some workers in philosophy of religion, some researchers in philosophy of religion, have thought that really what we're seeing here is a sign of bias, that the way that philosophy should go, the way should be working when we're trying to assess religious arguments, is to try to be neutral. Our prior religious beliefs shouldn't determine our assessment of the arguments. The arguments should stand or fall on their own merits. And if they aren't, if our religious beliefs are influencing how we think about the arguments, then we've got bias. And in fact, a number of people in philosophy of religion recently have thought that these biases are so prevalent that they contribute to the perceived poor health of philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion has been a booming area, and yet many people working in it think it's in very bad shape, that it's very divided, it's very partisan, and not much progress is made. So here's an example. Quote from Draper and Nichols in a 2013 article: "Partisanship is so entrenched that most philosophers of religion, instead of being alarmed by it, just take it for granted." So entrenched that they just take it to be the order of the day that we're divided on with regard to our prior religious beliefs. Then they offer a diagnosis of what's going on here. Bias grounded in the emotions and operating mostly at the non-conscious level is responsible for philosophy of religion's poor health. So here's their hypothesis as to what's going wrong. And they offer some sort of anecdotal, speculative reasons for thinking this might be the case, but they don't offer any evidence that this is what's really going on. Another couple of authors, De Cruz and De Schmet, a little bit later, sort of repeat this for setting up doing some empirical work to see if this is the case. They write, several authors have hypothesized that the religious beliefs of philosophers of religion, who are to a large extent Christian theists, unduly influence their appraisals of religious arguments, more specifically that theist philosophers of religion would evaluate the arguments in a selective way so that it supports their prior views. So here we see a little bit of lack of neutrality. In fact, that's what's going on in Draper and Nichols as well, though they don't say it quite so clearly. It's not that everyone just thinks, oh, it's wrong every which way. It's that the atheists and agnostics think that the religious philosophers are making too much of the arguments because they're being biased by their prior beliefs. That is, the target is Christian theists. De Cruz in particular has a particular hypothesis for this. She thinks it's not just bias, but a particular type of bias, confirmation bias. So this is a tendency to selectively attend to and evaluate evidence more positively when it's in line with one's prior beliefs. And this can also go the other way, what we call disconfirmation bias, although I'll just roll both of these together as confirmation bias as is typically done. And we might think, well, these sorts of biases, it shouldn't be affecting philosophers, people who have studied for a long time, PhDs and the like, but it turns out that that doesn't much matter when it comes to confirmation bias. So it's very robust, lots of data to show that this occurs, and that unlike other biases, it does not attenuate as a result of schooling, such that highly educated people are just as susceptible to this bias as those without academic training. So quite likely that we'd see this going on within philosophy. But that's an empirical question. De Cruz and then Kevin Tobia have both run a couple of empirical studies trying to get evidence that in fact philosophers in their assessment of religious arguments are showing signs of confirmation bias. They've aimed to test this. For De Cruz, it's very direct. She says this is what she's testing. Goal is to test the role of confirmation bias in natural theology, and she runs a study to do this. So I'm going to run through this study, but then suggest that in fact her study does not do a good job of testing the role of confirmation bias, that it's consistent with confirmation bias but doesn't actually test it. And then I'll suggest an alternative hypothesis to explain the data, to explain what we're seeing here, and then present some new empirical data to suggest that the alternative is at least as plausible as this hypothesis. Basic setup for Helen's study was like this. 802 participants. They were recruited through philosophy mailing lists and 3 blogs, Prosblogian, New Apps, and Feminist Philosophers. You might guess from the names here that these aren't necessarily neutral, and in fact, they have perspectives. We might worry, and in fact, I'll raise this worry as we go through, that this isn't a random sample of philosophers. This is a very selective sample. This is a philosophy of religion blog that has a fairly, I'm not sure the quite word, they've got a perspective on things. They're coming from a certain sort of angle. So we might worry at the outfront that we might get skewed data here. Here's how the study went. Each person, each philosopher was given the generic name for 8 arguments for the existence of God and 8 arguments against the existence of God. They weren't given the arguments, just the names. And the names are going to be things like the cosmological argument. So it's going to be very general. They then assess the argument by selecting a number on a scale going from 1 very weak to 5 very strong. They could also indicate that they were not familiar enough with the argument to say more. She then collected demographic information, including information about people's religious belief, where this included being theist, atheist, or agnostic/undecided. And joke here that as an agnostic, running this together with being undecided seems a little strange. I didn't think I was undecided. I just thought I was agnostic, but so it goes. Here's what the demographics look like. It's primarily professional philosophers, about a quarter are female, and that's in keeping with the profession at large. Philosophy has a gender gap. About 1 out of 4 professional philosophers in the Western world are female, so that's about right. This probably isn't right, at least not representative with regard to philosophers as a whole. About 40% theists, 40% atheists for her sample. Indications are that this is quite high on the theist end. Philosophers tend to be atheists and agnostics. I'm guessing the true number here is a bit more like 20% or so rather than 40%. In fact, we get some further indication that this is the case. De Cruz collected information on area of specialization, so the area in philosophy that these people are most specifically working on. We find about a third are reporting philosophy of religion as their primary area. Those of you who know a bit about philosophy, or at least academic philosophy today, will know that that's just grossly high. This isn't that big of an area in philosophy. It's, 10% might be a more realistic figure, and that might also be high. Turns out that this group, probably coming through this philosophy of religion blog, where people are going to be interested in answering a survey about philosophy of religion, well, it turns out they're much more religious. So 73% are theists. At a high number here, they're highly theist. That's probably pulling this number up. Long story short, we've got some reason to think that we're not getting a representative or random sample of philosophers here. That's what the data looks like. So these are the arguments for theism. Should say, I am not a philosopher of religion. So in Q&A, don't ask me too much about what all of these are. I can give you, a quick Wikipedia type rundown for most of them, but nothing too much more in depth. I think one thing to note very quickly as we look at these numbers are that 3 is basically the neutral point on this scale. 5 was saying it's good, 1 saying it's bad. Overall, as we average across, philosophers aren't terribly impressed with these arguments. They go from neutral for the cosmological argument to below for everything else. The arguments against theism, see at the very top, and the only one with sort of a positive score is the argument from evil. Turns out that this is an argument that theist philosophers of religion worry about quite a bit, that's why it gets a bump. But in general, overall, philosophers aren't thinking highly of any of these arguments. So what De Cruz and De Smet predict for this? We predict that philosophers evaluate arguments that support their prior beliefs as stronger than those that disconfirm their beliefs. So this is their confirmation bias hypothesis. Given that agnostics do not have a firm opinion on the matter, brackets, again, very bizarre, at least from my understanding of agnosticism, but so it goes, their beliefs would fall somewhere between those of theists and atheists. And the responses for their study are in line or in keeping with this prediction. Here's what they did. They calculated the total score for responses to the pro argument and then the total score for responses to the con argument. It's 8 arguments, scale of 1 to 5. So for each of these, we get 8 to 40. 8 would be extreme disagreement, 40 would be extreme agreement. Then the differences here they found were statistically significant, reason to think it's not just noise or randomness going on, and the effect sizes, the size of the difference was moderate to large. We get a pretty clear sort of result here. Here's what it looks like. Now, again, one thing we might want to keep in mind, especially because this graph is bad, remember you can't get a 0. So actually this should be starting about here to put things in scale a bit better. Not my graph, I took it from them. And we should remember that 25 is the neutral point. So really in general, no one's thinking especially highly of these arguments, even once we break it into groups. Key thing we find though, theists rate the pro arguments higher overall than the con arguments. Exactly the reverse for atheists. They rate the pro arguments pretty poorly and the con arguments a little bit higher, still about neutral overall, but we get a big gap here, and the gap goes the other way for the theists. And again, agnostics look sort of like the atheists, just a little bit more tempered. Here's what they conclude from this data. Our findings are consistent with a significant role of confirmation bias in philosophy of religion. And if they stopped there, I would have said, great, yes, your findings are consistent with this. It's consistent with confirmation bias. They continue on. Importantly, this bias is present in both theists and atheists. Atheists rate the argument against theism more strongly than theists and find the arguments for theism weaker than theists, and vice versa. Although being specialized in religion makes a difference for the assessment of some arguments, religious belief remains the best predictor of how the arguments are rated. When the first author reported preliminary findings of this survey on the philosophy blog Prosblogian, a number of philosophers expressed disapprobation at this significant role of confirmation bias, with one commenter writing, "My reading of this situation is that philosophy of religion is unhealthy." So we get, consistent with significant role of confirmation bias. Of course, that doesn't mean that other things aren't consistent with it as well. This is a pretty weak bar. But go down a couple sentences and all of a sudden we're talking about this significant role of confirmation bias. We've moved from it being consistent with, that is sort of a correlational sort of claim, to a clear causal claim. So we're giving a causal interpretation. The idea here is the way to explain these results is in terms of confirmation bias, that we're getting direct evidence of confirmation bias or seeing a significant effect of confirmation bias. Suppose that this interpretation is correct. We might then wonder if there's also reason to believe that this bias is present for both theists and atheists, which is what is being claimed here, that it's going both directions. But of course, we can't really claim that based on the evidence that I just gave you. Why? Well, because we don't know how good these arguments are outside of these assessments. We don't know if the pro arguments are better than the con or vice versa, or if they're of equal quality. So we could only say that both sides are getting it wrong if we were able to say exactly where it is. As is, we can make the claim that at least one side must be showing bias if the causal interpretation is correct, but we couldn't say which side. So something isn't quite right. Kevin Tobias's follow-up study in 2015 is targeting an objection sort of in this vicinity. So he notes that there are many different versions of these arguments. So if I say the cosmological argument, well, it turns out that this argument has a long history. There's lots and lots of different versions of it. And not everyone is going to think that all of these versions are equally good. In fact, some of the historical versions clearly shouldn't be thought to be very good. So, lots of different versions, but they weren't given a specific version. They were given these generic argument names. So Tobias notes it might be that theists tend to recall better versions of the pro arguments than non-theists, while non-theists tend to recall better versions of the con arguments than non-theists. Says, here's another possible explanation of what's going on. The arguments that occur to them. This would probably be still a type of bias, but not quite the bias that de Cruz was going for. Suggests a better methodology. Ideally, what we do is rather than giving these generic names, we'd give people arguments to assess. And even better, if we could give them explicit arguments of arguably equal quality, one concluding that God exists and one concluding that God doesn't exist. If we're seeing strong confirmation bias, we give them arguments of exactly the same quality, one yay God, one nay God, and they treat these differently, well then we've got some really strong evidence. So he tried to do this. He noted that we've got this sort of situation in the literature. In a couple famous sort of back and forth, we get two arguments that look very similar, such that if you think one is good, you'd be tough pressed to say why the other isn't also good. But they arrive at different conclusions. So first we get this argument being given in 73. We've got modal ontological argument, as it's called. Assumption starts with that which is possibly necessary is necessary. If you don't know what that means, you're probably in good company. I'm not exactly sure what possibly necessary amounts to. People who do modal logic claim to have thoughts about this. Definition: a being has maximal greatness if and only if necessarily it exists and is omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good. It's maximal greatness. Another premise: it is possible that there is a being with maximal greatness. Therefore, necessarily, there exists a being with maximal greatness. Therefore, there exists a being with maximal greatness, that is, God. So, conclusion, God exists. Again, this isn't stuff I do, so you shouldn't really want to hear what I think about this argument. But the thing that seems wrong to me, I think the argument just doesn't quite work. And the main problem is that this possibly isn't doing the same thing as this possible. This possible is a shrug your shoulders as far as we know. You know, I can't rule this out. What do I know sort of possible. This possibly is a more metaphysical sort of thing. They're not the same, so we've got a problem. Doesn't much matter. The key thing is that we get a follow-up in 2011 that notes that we can just throw in a knot, basically. We can put a knot into this premise, a knot that seems pretty okay. Yet it is possible that there is not a being with maximal greatness. And if you thought that it seemed pretty okay if the premise looked good, that it's possible that there is a being with maximal greatness, then surely it's also possible that there's not, or we'd be begging the question pretty badly here in this premise. So that looks okay, but then following through, therefore necessarily there does not exist a being with maximal greatness. Therefore, there does not exist a being with maximal greatness. That is, we get a conclusion that God doesn't exist. But it looks like these are pretty much equivalent. I think these go just as well. So, Kevin's basic setup is to give 64 participants pulled from the Philosophy of Religion blog both arguments, saw both of them as I just showed them to you, in random order. And then they were asked two questions. They were asked to rate the validity, just if it logically follows. Does the conclusion, if the premises are true, logically follow from those premises? And this is just a binary, either valid or invalid. Aaron asked for strength. So basically leaving this sort of undefined is just a notion of how good is the argument, and this was on a 10-point scale for each of the two arguments. Then took demographic information where this included religious belief, and he used theist, atheist, agnostic as the breakdown. Was all philosophers or theologians, 70% had advanced degrees in these area, 2% female, which for 64 people just means there was a woman. That's one of them. 10 atheists, 10 agnostics, and the remainder 44 theists. That's our breakdown for this. With regard to validity, he found amongst the theists a 23 percentage point difference in their assessment of these two arguments. And here again, remember, it looks like the two arguments, whatever you think of them, they've got basically the same structure. If one is valid, it looks like the other should. If the conclusion logically follows from the premises in one, tough to see why it wouldn't logically follow from the premises in the other. Yet we see a pretty significant difference. And in fact, this is statistically significant and a fairly large effect. For non-theists, we found a 10 percentage point difference. This wasn't statistically significant. That means we can't rule out that this is just noise. Now, this might be because non-theists, so putting together atheists and agnostics, we've got 20 of them. So 20 of them total, not a very large sample size, so it might be that this isn't significant just because we didn't have enough people. Strength. Found differences in ratings for both the pro and con argument. What he did, what's being shown in this graph, is taking this difference. So taking the score out of 10 for the pro argument, subtracting the score out of 10 for the con argument. We find that the atheists are down into the negatives now. That is, they rated the con argument slightly stronger than the pro argument. Agnostics basically in the middle, and theists, about a 2.5 point difference. They rated the pro argument as much stronger than the con argument, just like we'd predict based on there being bias going on here. Kevin writes, in conclusion, theists, but not atheists or agnostics, saw a modal ontological argument as logically valid more often when it established God's existence compared to when it established God's non-existence. There was a main effect of religious belief on the perceived strength of the modal ontological argument. Atheists rated the against argument as stronger than the for. Agnostics rated the arguments roughly equivalently, and theists rated the for argument as stronger than the against. Then Kevin, just like Helen, goes in and gives it a causal interpretation. Got this all true. It goes a little bit further, says the results demonstrate an effect of religious belief on argument analysis. So, in effect, going on, giving it some causal language, saying what's going on is that the prior religious belief caused assessment of the arguments, has something going on here. Then continues, claiming that one argument is better than the other might save one group from empirical challenge, from the evidence here that there is bias. Then notes that, but to ground an objection, one must not merely posit a novel interpretation, one must also defend the existence of a plausible interpretation of the for and against arguments such that one is stronger than the other and only one is valid. But remember that I was just saying, we didn't actually have any straightforward evidence of a difference in validity rating for non-theists. We did for theists, but for non-theists, there was a difference. It wasn't statistically significant though. So to be we just can't, basically what that's telling us is we can't feel very confident that it's not noise. And so this might give us reason to investigate it further. It's not nothing, but again, we shouldn't make a stronger conclusion than that. When it comes to strength, though, we did see an effect both directions, but I think there is a plausible reason now going on here for why atheists would rate the con arguments as stronger. And the reason is that these arguments are part of this larger dialectic. So by closely mirroring the standard modal ontological argument, but arriving at the opposite conclusion, the con argument serves to point out a serious flaw in the pro argument, and plausibly Tobias participants, being philosophers of religion and the like, are probably aware of this dialectic, at least the atheists. It seems like the response argument actually is, in my view, fairly strong. If you can take someone else's argument, make slight changes that they have to agree with, and get the opposite conclusion, that doesn't mean your argument, in its own is strong, but the argument overall and the dialectic is really strong. That's some pretty good reason to think the argument you're responding to has a problem, that it shows too much, something along these lines. So this would be a reason for thinking it might only go one direction. Okay. Your worry. Both De Cruz and Tobias are describing their results in these causal terms, as we saw. Religious belief affecting assessment, being a causal thing, with De Cruz explicitly taking her results to provide evidence of confirmation bias, and I think Kevin's doing the same thing. He doesn't say confirmation bias, but he's thinking bias, and he's responding to De Cruz. I think he's also thinking confirmation bias ultimately. But what we've got here is correlational data. Now, it is possible to get evidence of causal relations from correlational data, but it's not easy, and it's not what they did. They didn't run the sorts of stats that might, in optimal circumstances, allow you to make some reasonably justified causal claims based on your correlational data, but that's not the sort of stats they were running. They just made a leap. I think they made the leap because this is a plausible interpretation of the correlational data, the causal interpretation. But it's not the only one. It's not the only plausible interpretation here, so it's not clear that we should accept the causal conclusion. De Cruz talks about this a little bit. She considers the issue a bit. She writes, there are independent reasons for suspecting that the causal arrow goes from religious belief to acceptance of the argument rather than the other way, and goes to Draper and Nichols, who note a bit anecdotally that some prominent defenders in the literature tend to start their philosophical careers as theists, whereas those who defend arguments against theism started as atheists, and then that few authors change their metaphysical outlook over time as they debate these arguments. So it gives a reason for thinking, yeah, we should take this to be causal in the way suggested. I think this is a little bit dubious. First, it's a bit anecdotal. The reason for doing these studies is to try to get away from being quite so anecdotal. That's probably not the biggest bit. I think a little bit more problematically is that it's unclear that the start of one's philosophical career is the right time to be doing this assessment. These authors, it's not like once they got their first job as philosophers, they suddenly thought, oh, let me start thinking about these theological arguments. These are philosophers of religion. They were thinking about it in their grad studies. They were thinking about it as undergrads, and chances are this is stuff they were thinking about well before. And in fact, the little bit I've glanced at it, there's reason to suspect from the biographical material that this is just the case. Regardless, so I think both of these are reasonable objections. Throw them out the door. Regardless, there's a bigger difficulty, and the problem is that it isn't just two possibilities. So really what De Cruz is considering is, well, she thinks belief affects assessment, and is then considering, well, it could go the other way. Do we have reason maybe assessment affects belief? But it's more complex than that. Even just keeping to simple bits. Could be complex with lots of other stuff going on, but just some simple sort of models could be, we've got a back and forth. Maybe over time that you hear an argument, it affects your belief, that affects the arguments in the future, and we've got some cycling going on. Could be something else. It could be that there's not even a correlation in the general population, that what she's done is to induce a correlation by having a feature of the sample, so a sample that she's going after, if the sample is such that your belief makes it more likely that you have the feature of the sample getting selected, and same for assessment, then it would look like we've got a causal relation here. It would look like we'd get this correlation, but it's really not for any real reason. It's be a bit spurious. And as I sort of suggested earlier, I think there's a place to see this going on. People reading the Philosophy of Religion blog might be thought, yeah, more likely to read this blog if you're a believer, and more likely to believe this blog if you have a positive assessment of these arguments. This could be going on. Here's another thing that could be going on, and the one I'll focus on. There could be a common cause. So basically just reversing this, it could be that there's something else going on in people that when they've got this common cause, it makes them more likely to believe and more likely to assess the arguments in a certain way. And from the cognitive science of religion literature, this empirical literature, there's a good sort of hypothesis for what this common cause could be, what's often called thinking style, that people's thinking style might both affect their belief and their assessment of the argument. So here's my alternative. The thinking style distinction I'm after is what usually goes by the label of analytic versus intuitive in the cognitive science of religion literature and more broadly. It's just the extent to which a person tends to rely on reflective judgments, that is slow, deliberate, high-effort judgments, what are sometimes called system 2 judgments, places where you stop and have to think. You're not just going on your hunch, you're not just acting, you stop and sort of slowly and deliberately think through the problem. System 2, reflective judgments, as opposed to intuitive judgments, fast, automatic, low effort, sometimes called system one judgments. So this isn't to say that people who are more likely to make reflective judgments are better at reflection or better at their reflective judgments. They're just more likely to engage these brain systems. They're more likely to use these high effort, slow, deliberate systems when confronted with a problem than the people who are more intuitive. So a difference in how likely you are to engage system two as opposed to just going ahead with system one. Now, I think here it's fairly easy to see how this would correlate with assessment of complex arguments, say a modal ontological argument, especially if those arguments have intuitive or counterintuitive conclusions. If you've got a very intuitive conclusion, and it's going to take a whole lot of effort, slow, deliberate thinking to try to work through the argument, well, if you're less likely to engage those systems that will do the slow reflection, more likely to just go with your intuitive judgments, then you're more likely to just accept the argument. That's going to follow. Well, going back to the cognitive science of religion, a bunch of recent work, in fact, you might just think this is sort of a pillar of work in cognitive sciences of religion now, is that belief in God or gods, either lowercase or upper, singular or plural, is intuitive. That this is just intuitive to humans, that humans sort of naturally believe in God or tend to believe in God, and this is something that then needs to be overwritten. Possibly it just emerges as a natural result or maybe a byproduct of the normal operation of certain cognitive systems. Perhaps our mind reading, that when I look out at all of you, I can make some guesses as to what you're thinking that makes sense to think you're thinking things based on facial expressions, etc. A lot of brain matter goes to doing this, and maybe it overgeneralizes, that we start putting minds into other things in the world, some of them very powerful and unpredictable, become gods. Some get elevated to big god status, like the gods of the Abrahamic religion. Religions, plural. Right. If this is correct, and I'll just take this for granted largely at this point, a large body of literature on this, if it's correct, then we'd expect that belief in God is going to correlate with intuitive thinking style, and disbelief is going to correlate with analytic thinking style. So got some predictions here, and in fact this hypothesis was independently suggested by a number of labs at the same time and has received a good deal of support at this point. Here's the typical measure for how we figure out whether you're likely to be reflective or not. The idea is, it's not the only test, but it's the main test used. And easy to show you, it's the cognitive reflection test from Frederick. I'll just call it the CRT. The idea is that most of you, when you see these problems, are likely to have an intuitive guesses to the answer. So a bat and a ball costs $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? And I think most of you, the answer that'll just first jump out at you is to say 10 cents. But if you say 10 cents, that can't be right if you stop and think about it a bit more, because the bat costs $1 more than the ball. If the ball's 10 cents, then the bat's $1.10. $1.10 plus 10 is $1.20, but they're $1.10 in total. So once you notice that, you're probably going to be able to, sort of work through to the answer, which is 5 cents. Each of these works the same sort of way. So then we measure people getting the correct answer or giving the intuitive answer. A few different labs. So here's Shenhav, Rand, and Green. Rand, maybe? Not exactly sure. 2012, they measured belief in God, so confident atheist, confident believer, etc., and against intuitive answers to the CRT, and they got a correlation of 0.18 basically. For correlation, just to give you a sense of this, this is a small to medium effect. It's a decent correlation. All of this is going to be significant. Just tells us that we don't have reason to think it's probably just noise. Effect size will be more interesting. It's a moderate effect. Gervais and Noor Zion, at basically the exact same time we're doing this as well. They looked at intrinsic religiosity intuitive religious beliefs such as I believe in God, and then belief in supernatural agents. And they correlated these with correct answers to the CRT, so now we get a negative correlation. And it's sort of in keeping with the same sort of range. We're small to medium across these. Third lab, Pennycook et al., same year, looked at religious engagement. How important is religion in your daily life, etc. Found a similar sort of correlation. Also looked at religious belief. Found a slightly stronger correlation. Of course, these two are highly correlated. Religious engagement and religious belief tend to go together. Not surprisingly, if you're a believer, you're more likely to be engaged in a church, etc. If you're engaged in a church, well, got some good reason to believe or face some cognitive dissonance there. Get similar results with other measures, so including base rate problems, intuitive physics problems, and also from other labs, most recently Tony Jack in an article that just came out a bit ago. These results are all for general samples, not philosophers, people in general, including undergrads in the US and Canada, and online through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. But there might be some reason to think that the correlation will be even stronger amongst philosophers. Some work I was involved in has showed that philosophers in general are really good at this. Since I'm running long, I'm just going to through this. It turns out that holding education constant, philosophers do better than non-philosophers of the same education level on CRT, and this is a pretty robust finding. So given that, we might think, oh, maybe these correlations will be even more pronounced for philosophers. And then I thought, as I'm looking at this, well, I've actually got a lot of data that bears on this. Data I collected for completely different purposes, not for this purpose, but I've got data collected online for 71,000 people and change, where they've completed the CRT, as well as giving me demographic information about their religion, and including their religion and religiosity, just how religious, how engaged in their religion. And this includes 524 philosophers, people with an MA or a PhD in philosophy. Turns out the numbers start looking the same whether I break it down by MA or PhD. At this point, they look pretty identical. For the overall sample, so all 71,000 people, we find a smaller correlation than expected based on the other results. So a correlation of about -0.1. For all of these, I'll give you men then women in brackets afterwards. Reason there's gender differences in CRT responses, it's pretty stable and pretty strong. No thoughts about why this is the case, no thoughts whatsoever, but it's there, so I'll report the data for you. A small effect, not nothing, but it's not an especially large effect. Looking at it further though, what I found is it looked like CRT varied dramatically with religion. So this is the CRT score, it's the number of correct responses, 3 possible total. Turns out atheists and agnostics, as expected, are pretty high, but they're in and amongst some other religious groups. Turns out Catholics, other Christians are down at the very bottom, and then the rest of the religions are just in the middle. Take it easy. So looks like we're getting some religious diversity here, and it could be that this smaller correlation, again on a huge sample, might just be that it's smaller because my sample's more diverse. It's got more religious diversity. This raises some doubts about the intuitiveness component with how I got here. Needs to be explored further, but some reason for doubt. For philosophers, we find a much stronger correlation, stronger than we were seeing in any of the other studies. So the general correlation is -0.382 amongst the MAs and PhDs in philosophy, which is a medium to a large effect, medium-large effect. Can see this in a number of different ways. If I take the low religiosity people, we get a CRT men 1.83, women 0.93 is about 3 times to 4 times higher than for the high religiosity people. So big increase. Also a strong correlation if we take, instead of correct answers, the intuitive answers, we get a strong positive correlation. if we compare those people who gave all intuitive answers, they got the 3 intuitive answers, to those who gave the 3 correct answers, we find that the people giving the intuitive answers were more religious by a good margin, more likely to be Christian by a good margin, 80 out of 128 versus 17 out of 101, while the people who gave the 3 analytic answers were more likely to be atheists or agnostics. 2. Again, this varied with religion. Agnostics and atheists and none up at the top, but again, Hindus and Buddhists quite high, and then Catholics and other Christians down, falling into the bottom. If we focus on the comparison suggested by the philosophy of religion literature, suggested by De Cruz and Tobias, we find a dramatic difference between Christian theists. So I think what really matters for these philosophy of religion debates is the back and forth between atheists and Christian theists. Well, we find, if we look at Christian theists, that is Catholics, Protestants, other Christians with a religiosity score of 4 or 5, and then non-theists, agnostics or atheists with a religiosity score of 1 or 2, we find a dramatic difference. The non-theists had CRT scores 4 times higher, and they were about 70% likely, if you knew you were one of these non-theists, have a 70% chance to get one of the questions right, compared to 17.5% for the Christian theists. If we restrict to just Christians and atheists or agnostics, we get a even stronger correlation, negative 0.455, getting into a large effect. If we restrict to Christian theists and non-theists like I just did, this goes up really high, up over 0.62, which is absurdly large for this sort of data, the social science sort of stuff. This is a really, really strong correlation. So overall, we find a strong correlation between thinking style and religiosity among philosophers, even stronger when we compare Christians with atheists and agnostics, especially Christian theists with non-theists. I think the upshot for this, what we should be thinking here, is that this is a plausible common cause explanation of the findings of differences in assessment of natural theological arguments, saying that this is the explanation, it is the only explanation, but the data supports it and it's plausible enough. Given this, we have no really specific reason to think that the disagreements concerning natural theological arguments, these arguments for or against the existence of God, are being driven by confirmation bias. At least the data doesn't seem to present us any further reason than we brought in to begin with, which itself would be a bit of confirmation bias. Not good sign, I think, for philosophy of religion, or a sign of good health. You might think quickly, like, oh, so vindicated, philosophy of religion's going well. No, it's not that the theists tend to evaluate the arguments in a selective way so that it supports their prior views, but that their evaluations just tend to be more suspect here, which also isn't good news. There's some reason to think this might not be terrible, some reason to think that the more empathetic you are, the less likely you are to be reflective. And we might think that there's benefits to empathy, especially in philosophy, especially when we get into ethics and value theory, but some worries as well. Limitations on this study. It was collected for other purposes. So this is data I already had and then ran the analysis of. And because of that, I didn't collect some things that are relevant. There's no data on religious belief, only a single measure of thinking style. I haven't assessed argument evaluation as De Cruz and Tobias did. Only took limited demographics. This wasn't targeted at philosophers, so I didn't ask about areas of specialization. I'm currently doing some research to try to address this, a further study goal is to get a systematic sample of philosophers. So we'll take a stratified sample, try to do a better job there, and we're going to use multiple measures of religious belief and engagement coming from the psych literature, multiple measures of thinking style, not just the CRT, and control for general cognitive ability, as well as taking extended demographics. And this is being done with Kevin Tabaya, Edouard Machery, and Stephen Stitch. Thank you very much. Yeah, great. Yeah.
Yeah, I apologize for missing the first couple minutes, but I realized one of my questions is the focus on the modal version of the ontological argument. Could you say a little bit at the start of your talk about why that one was picked instead of the design argument or the moral argument?
Yeah, so I take it that Tobias' goal there is to have it be as plausible as possible that the two arguments are of equal quality, are equally good, or at least certainly that they'd look equally valid. So that you've got an argument or a pair of arguments that are differing in only this slight bit and getting you the opposed conclusions makes it look like a pretty nice test case. In other ways, we might think that it's a pretty, to someone who doesn't deal in those sorts of arguments, I think it looks sort of strange and maybe a little odd, I don't know. But yeah, that's the reason, is that he could get the symmetry that would be a little bit harder to do with most other types of arguments. Yeah.
So you, this is more clarification than anything. You brought up the point where analytic versus intuitive kind of matches up to system 2 and system 1 thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, if these previous De Cruz and Tobias were writing about confirmation bias, generally it's seen that confirmation bias does arise more when you're using system 1 thinking than when you're using system 2 thinking. So if you're making this correlation with the system 1 and system 2 thing, this seems to reinforce their previous claims, confirmation bias. Maybe it's not entirely a reinforcement, but it does seem to correlate with their findings as well.
Yeah, so I should probably look at this a bit more. I was under the impression that you get confirmation bias still continuing even when people are trying to engage reflectivity. But, so cool, I'll look at that a bit more. I think what I want to say overall is not that, I'd be shocked if there isn't confirmation bias going on here. I would expect that it's part of the story. I think it's not as big of a part of the story as this is suggesting, and the evidence doesn't show it as directly. In part, I got interested in looking at this a bit, that mainly I just get sort of ticked off when I read clearly correlational stuff being quickly moved to causal terms without thinking out the alternatives, and was reading this in De Cruz's book. So this was a chapter, the De Cruz and De Schmidt 2016 is a chapter in an edited volume that she did on experimental philosophy of religion, and where there's a bunch of cognitive science of religion in the chapters right before it. So I was reading, and had just been reading stuff that sets up basically this as a plausible alternative explanation, 20 pages earlier. So think, and then thinking, I've got some data on it. So look, I expect, and hopefully this, the study that we're starting to run now will give a little bit more of an indication that we'll have enough different measures and data that we can see, we can run some causal modeling and see what it's looking like. And I wouldn't be surprised to see that, we get belief affecting assessment of the arguments, but also that both, I wouldn't be surprised to see thinking style affecting belief end affecting assessment, but also belief affecting assessment, and with different strengths that we'll see, and maybe some also the arrow going the other way, depending on how we write it in.
Do we know if there are correlations between thinking style and a person's attachment to one ethical theory or another?
No, that I know. I think that that's so really
the
fascinating.
follow-up would be something like, would that be, if there were, would that be evidence of ethics being unhealthy?
Ah. Interesting. So I wouldn't be terribly surprised to see this as a part I didn't go into of this last study with Jonathan Livengood and Andrew Higgins. I'm doing sort of a separate project where we'll take, using some questions done by Brigette and Chalmers on philosophers' beliefs about philosophical issues. We did some factor analysis to find, so first some evidence that philosophers sort of lightly cluster in a couple of ways, what we might call rationalist and empiricist, for want of better terms. And we figured out what are basically 6 questions that capture this about as well as the full set. That's going to be included in this study. And part of our thinking is that through the ethics and empathy sort of line that we have, and maybe some of through sort of essentialist thinking, we have some reason to think that these philosophical camps are going to have a thinking style correlation, which might be some reason to think philosophy has some bad health generally. I wouldn't be surprised to see that, yeah, the debates between, say, utilitarians and virtue theorists and Kantian, some of these big position ethical camps, that those would show, I don't think people get there via the arguments. It seems like it's often something about them that say, oh yeah, this person seems sort of Kantian, and then lo and behold. So it'd be there. Some other personality measures have shown some stuff here. So some stuff from Adam Feltz and Ed Coakley suggests that there are some personality bits that pick up certain sorts of philosophical positions, including in ethics. So I think likely, and I think that would be some signs of bad health, at least for these arguments that seem awfully intractable. That when you've got camps, and I think this is an area where you do, and they just butt heads, and if this is not being responsive to the arguments, but is something being driven by some prior psychological stuff, that strikes me as a touch unhealthy. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I can imagine some people looking at these results and thinking to themselves, well, maybe it's true that the higher numbers of more analytic thinkers in the philosophy of religion cluster around the agnostic atheist category. But is it possible that there are other kinds of theses, apart from the philosophy of religion, that the analytic thinking types would tend to cluster around, where we would actually view that as a somewhat a pox on your analytic thinking skills.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
maybe they tend to be Holocaust deniers more often, or figure out some other sort of epistemic badness that they happen to be associated with.
Yeah, so I think that that's something in that vicinity is quite plausible. So there's that 2016 paper by Anthony Jack and colleagues that I sort of gestured at. They provide some evidence for thinking, and keeping with an ongoing hypothesis of Jack's, that We've got system 2, so the brain systems involved in system 2, that engaging this basically is to disengage stuff being used for empathy. That to get into your reflective thinking is to think less empathetically. When we're being empathetic, we're often just going with our feel, and this I think has some just sort of common sense, that, oh, we think cold and calculating. That's sort of the reflective, the problem solving. And we might think in various areas of philosophy, being more cold and calculating might be just not good. We might think, coming back to the ethics stuff, that maybe this leads to some of the things that utilitarians float. For example, non-utilitarians seem to think seems just awfully sinister, holding like, oh yeah, maybe it works out, but that it's not quite my area, but it seems like there's some room that goes on. There's also areas where, so like some of this stuff comes up in the testing literature that for students in the room, it turns out that using your system 2 stuff for lots of different test questions isn't the best strategy. That often, if it's something involving memory, pattern recognition sort of stuff, you just try not to talk yourself out of it. Often your quick judgments as to what the answer is more likely to, now, not always, don't come back to me and say, hey, I screwed up this test, because, but often if you don't quite know, but it is stuff you've looked over, your quick judgment will do better than try to think it through, and it'll talk yourself out of the correct answer. And this is backed up by the empirical literature. So it's not always going to be the case that being more reflective is going to help us in a given situation. So basically, yes, response. I think that the ultimate story is going to be a bit more nuanced here. What I'd hope to see, this has a way I can give a little bit of a dig, make it a bit more controversial, but I think ultimately the real upshot will be that the more we know about the way that different personal tendencies, personality traits and such drives our philosophical thinking, sort of biases our philosophical thinking, the ways we go about it, the more we can sort of compensate for that. Hopefully the more we can recognize in discussion differences in where we're coming from that perhaps can lead to better health overall for the discipline.
So on that last point, it certainly would be a help if that could help alleviate some differences and go, oh, well, I'm coming from this perspective. But I'm sure in these studies, the theist philosophers and non-theist philosophers both thought that, for example, those two very similar arguments were valid or invalid for reasons besides their previous beliefs. They thought that they had an insight to the argument to show why it was good or why it was bad. So even if we do get this evidence that previous beliefs or system 2 versus system 1 thinking kind of shows these biases for certain areas, I mean, how likely do you think it is that they'll actually affect the field and people just won't go, well, that's not about me, I do have good reasons to say blah, blah, blah.
Okay, good. Yeah, so here's something that I think could plausibly be done that's in the vicinity that we might still be seeing, that in assessing these arguments, that it is a reflecting their relative reflectivity or intuitiveness. It is as they glance through this doing the study, they just sort of like, oh yeah, this conclusion looks, they don't think about it as hard as they might. Now, some will think about it much harder, but we're talking about that sort of different. So the more religious might be a bit more like just, oh yeah, the conclusion, so go ahead with it, than not. But philosophers overall are also, I think there's some reason to think that one thing we really excel at is post hoc rationalization. That we're really good at coming up with reasons for thinking that what we said, even if we said it without really thinking it through, was right. Anecdotally, I think this goes on a lot. Anecdotally, often when I give these talks, I think that's really the thing I'm doing, that not always, but for some of the questions where I don't really have time to think super hard up here. Here's what comes to mind, and then start spinning a story afterwards as to why that might be correct. I think philosophers are good at this. There's actually some evidence that this is something that goes on a good bit. So we might get that, you can see, turns out we're being influenced by this stuff, but philosophers will still, I've got my post hoc rationalizations for that. And they take this to be the reason they went with it, to fill in the story of where their intuition went from, so that they were just doing some intuitive thinking might end up not mattering, that we'll just get it bypassed because they'll read in their post hoc bits. On a more skeptical side, it certainly is no guarantee that our getting more clear on this stuff will improve philosophy. It might be that we'll be very stubbornly resistant to trying to get more clear on things. Yeah.
I believe I heard you say you did not want to comment on the possible explanations for the gender differences in numbers. Is that right? You didn't really want to comment on that?
So I don't even know that I want to plead the fifth, because that might make it sound like I think there's something bad going on here that I'm not. I don't know. I think there's a good number. I think there's a lot of things that might be thought. This came up, I gave this talk at Davis yesterday, and Zoe Grayson, am I getting her name right? I might not be. Does philosophy of psychology, and she suggested a explanation in terms of basically enculturation, that what might be going on here is that we, of course, all are more or less likely to engage System 2 resources in different settings. And it might be that, especially in the US where most of this data is, that women are being enculturated in ways we're all familiar with, to think, numbers are hard and math's hard, like the Barbie said, and sort of thing. So it might be that through these factors, it's just in this domain, they're less likely to engage System 2, so that this test isn't quite getting us what we want, at least for purposes of doing a gender comparison. Similar numbers hold up for base rate problems and intuitive physics problems, though. So I'm not sure that'll be a full explanation, but we might think intuitive physics problems are going to fall into the same sort of thing. So here's one possible explanation. The results are, it goes all the way back to Frederick's 2005. He found a dramatic gender difference. It replicates over and over. In my own data on, with the 70,000 people, the gender difference is start like 50% difference or so. It's large. Yeah. One thing I should really note here for this is that, again, this isn't an indication that people who do poorly on the CRT or who are less reflective, it's not that they're worse at reflective thinking or those judgments. They're just less likely to employ those resources. And again, that's not always a bad thing as well, that if there is this trade-off between empathy, et cetera, a lot of the time, and in just ordinary situations, the best way to proceed is to use your system one stuff, and an over-reliance on system two just isn't going to be especially positive. So it's easy to see this as being, even if these results are right and can't be explained away in some sense, that this is, I think some people want to read it as yay men, boo women, but it's not at all clear that that's what we should come to from that, or that this is women having a deficit and men an advantage or anything like that. It's probably not the way to be looking at it.
I was not seeing this reflected in the categories and numbers that you showed us, but do you know if there are differences among the theists between those who tend to think of the traditional theistic arguments as successful in showing that, yes, there is a God or something like that, and those theists who think that the traditional theistic arguments are not successful, but they still believe in God because they're Reformed epistemologists, or they believe in some other way for the cognitive systems to function, to ascertain the truth of religious propositions, not through deductive arguments or even inductive arguments.
Good. The data on philosophers isn't that in depth. For people in general, at least one of the studies, and I won't remember which one now, asks some questions that start to get at some aspects of where your religious beliefs might come from. If I'm remembering correctly, so grain of salt, if I'm remembering correctly, they didn't find a very strong correlation for childhood religious belief. That what seemed to matter was where they end up, not the childhood stuff going on, although of course there's a correlation between being an adult believer and being raised in a household of believers. Those fit together. But it also, if I'm remembering correctly, and again, grain of salt, wasn't a major factor for whether people had sort of a conversion experience, a religious experience that they pointed to, a personal thing. That didn't seem to be what was driving this. So if I remember the study right, they tested some of these things as a way, sort of an alternative explanation, and then doing some more complex statistical analyses. Didn't have reason to, they more or less rule out that this seemed to be driving the effect. So it looks a bit more general. Maybe for philosophers, that's going to be different. It could be that philosophers are perhaps more likely to divide up to be more strongly influenced by either the arguments or experience in ways that exclude each other. This came up yesterday as well, so I might look at adding a question or two about this to the study that we're starting in on. I hadn't included it because I was just using some measures that showed the strongest correlations in the general population, but this strikes me as fairly interesting with regard to philosophers specifically, so I might put that back in. Yeah.
So with going back to possible explanations of correlation, Ducruz and Tobias came up with belief then assessment, and assessment to belief. And you're saying that another possible explanation is thinking style affecting both belief and assessment. It seems to me that it doesn't make much sense to think of thinking style affecting both belief and assessment in and of themselves separately. it seems that it would be more of a thinking style coming before belief and assessment or assessment.
Oh.
So, because if you think in a certain way and you see an argument, your assessment of that will feed into the belief, or if, like you said, the belief in God is intuitive, then if system one drives you to have that belief, then that will lead into assessment. So it's more, it seems more of like a 3-step process on the chain than just affecting both these things individually.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I can see that for especially if we start thinking it out through time a bit more, that we might be thinking that for the general data on the CRT, their hypothesis, is that thinking style is affecting belief because belief in God is more intuitive, so this goes through and can give the same line for the assessment of the arguments. So you might think, okay, if belief is coming before, as would seem likely often, before you're really seeing any firm argument, you're getting something, but usually we raise kids into a religion we don't start early on by giving them complex arguments for the existence of God. What do you think, little Johnny? And then, you think, yeah, okay, we'll take you to church. So that seems plausible. I think it's going to be very tough to disentangle how, I think those 3 graphs are going to be pretty tough to disentangle because we'd be getting the strong temporal component where we're talking extended bits of time. In part, this will be tough to disentangle because we're not going to be seeing people looking at new arguments for the most part that they haven't seen before, at least for most relevant philosophers. So, yeah, interesting. I'll need to think about this a bit more, and probably, so once we get our new results through, we will do some causal modeling, and that's a direction for setting things up that we'll need to consider.
This may actually just be piggybacking off of his question, but I noticed that in your diagrams and flowcharts that you were presenting as possibilities, you included both the ones where the arrow is going one way between belief and assessment, but then you also included ones where the arrows are going both ways. But I think that when you put the icons up showing that third category of thinking style or whatever, the alternatives that you brought up were variations on one-way arrows.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility that there is a two-way arrow between that third thing, whether it's thinking style or reading proslogion?
Yeah, so this sort of situation and then thing in to here. Yeah, so for thinking style, I mean, the thought is usually going to be that this is something fairly basic and set pretty early on. But, so I'd sort of lean against thinking these arrows will go both ways, and probably not from assessment, but then maybe belief. I'd also tend to think, depending on how early belief is coming and the thinking about it, that this could be the sort of thing that would start influencing just how, personality isn't set at birth, including things like relative thinking style. I certainly wouldn't want to completely rule this out, and I expect the overall story is going to have, I expect there's still going to be the arrows back and forth here. It's just not going to be strong. We're going to have and maybe other common causes we should look at it as well, and usually turns out for things like this that the real causal story, is going to be much more complex than what we're thinking, and almost certainly more complex than this picture.